All right. I'm here. What's that? No, I think it's fine. All right, Summers. I'm here a little early. I don't know where to find the comments. But wait, let me do this so I have the period outline in front of me. Can I do that? It looks like I can. All right, so what do we want to talk about here? I think the chat comes over here. I only see one person on, so maybe I'm too early. Nope, I see nobody on. All right. I think I'm all by myself, Alicia. I don't think anyone's on.
Olivia? Why'd you go around the back? Well, Daddy's on the video thing.
It's fine. Oh, that's what that means? I have 2 viewers? Oh, now I have 3.
Whoa. You've been live for
very-
that long. Now you have 4.
I have
Very
4?
dark.
Popular.
It's dark in here though.
It's
And
fine.
then
Oh, now I have 5. Can I tell who it is?
I think if you click on it, you click on that.
I tried
Let's see.
clicking on it. It's not telling me.
Oh.
Should
Then
be
like
able to.
people need to comment it, stuff. I don't know. Yeah, you should be able to.
Are they writing to you?
No.
See what
Hey,
you-
guys, whoever's out there, just say something so I can see it pop up. So I can learn how to do this. Hello, anything.
Olivia, can you
There we
See?
go. Thank you,
Olivia
Andy.
said hi.
So this is clearly working.
Olivia, honey.
All right.
Yeah.
There's only 3 of you on so far.
Put the
Let's
lamp off my
let's go.
dresser
Okay,
so I can
excellent.
give him
Christian, what's up?
his light bulb.
All right, nice. Okay. So there's only a few of you up here. We can wait a couple minutes. As I said 8:10. I just wanted to make sure that this worked. What are you doing back there?
Getting you another light.
Oh, I think that it's fine. They can
No,
see
it's
me.
very dark.
They can see me. You're gonna put it on that side? You can't put it on that side
Really?
because I have.
Right here. And I'll plug it in. Right here. Lydia.
All right, there's 7 now.
Lydia.
Well, I don't have another. I don't have another.
Right here.
It's really not that bad.
It's not gonna.
That's fine. Just plug it in there. Oh, give me a little more. Thank you, sweetheart. Oh, I see Emma. Emma's here.
There you go.
All right.
Is that better?
Absolutely. It makes it look like I had a big idea that just popped into my head right there.
Ducky
All right. Oh, guys, look. That's the dog. Everything's echoing. I'm not quite sure what to do about that one.
It's because there's no rug in here.
Oh, it's probably echoing because there's no rug in my office.
Go get a rug.
Would it help maybe if I put on a speaker?
Why don't you go sit on the other room?
Which room? In the living room?
Go sit in the living room. Sit right here on the couch.
Oh, I need to clean up my stuff.
All right, we're gonna start in a couple minutes, guys. Is it still echoing, Emma? I'm looking. Oh, is it echoing for everyone else? I don't know. How about no? Yes, maybe. I don't know. Oh, look, someone is fine. All right, so Emma, it could be yours. Why don't you try signing out and signing back in again? It might just be your browser. You should be using, yeah, that's what I would try. Try leaving and coming back. We're going to start in like 2 minutes. I just want to give people time to get on. Oh, that's good to know, Siobhan. She's watching it on her phone, guys, just so that you know that.
What channel?
I don't know what channel I'm on. Hey, Kylie. So we have Kylie, we have Chris, we have Andy. Emma had to jump off. She can jump back on. And we have Siobhan. But I see 9 people. I don't know who's in there. All right. So, guys, listen. It's okay. I don't think I'm echoing. I think it's just with one.
No, I was just
All right. So
say
let's.
hello.
Oh, okay. Tessie wants to say hello. Here, let me see. She's all wet. Here, watch this. Wait. She's good now. Wait. Don't get on the computer. Say hi. That's Tessie. All right. There you go.
Oh, no.
See, I knew she was going to do that. She got my
You
computer.
put her there.
Well, how are you going to get her close to the camera? All right, we're good. I'm going to. Oh, no, that's not. Yeah,
but what's
that's
your
not. I don't know, sweetheart. It's a link.
channel? 'Cause
It's-
then I can figure out.
It's a link here.
Can you send it to me?
I can. It's on Google Classroom here.
I just figured out that if you shake your phone, it says undo typing.
All right, I really want to do this. So here, go on here, go to period 7 or period 5, and you'll see the link.
Okay, done.
Send it to yourself. All right, so there's quite a few of you guys on. So why don't we start this? All right, so look, I really want to focus on period 1 for this. Let's start with that and just kind of go through each of the concepts. Then I'll be looking over here to see if there's any questions. All right. So this is your opportunity to ask questions on period 1. We'll start with that, and then maybe we can get into period 2. So take out your concept outlines and let's start there. And if you look at 1.1, this is going back to September. This is back in the summertime, guys, when you guys were working really, really hard in July, on the beach, checking out history. We have, as native populations migrated and settled across the vast expanse of North America over time, they developed distinct and increasingly complex societies by adapting to and transforming their diverse environments. So do you remember this a little bit, where we started talking about how you live, or how does where you live affect how you live? And that was a key piece that we looked at the beginning of the year. We explored a lot of the different Native American tribes and understood how they started to settle, coming over from Alaska, moving or in the strait there, and then kind of migrating into North America. And that's what this is about. And it was so A, B, C, and D are really all about how these societies came over. There's going to be very few questions on period 1. And maybe you'll get a multiple choice question. Maybe you'll get, but for the writing, if you guys were to look at the outline here, which I have in front of me, typically the writing goes, it's periods 3 through 8. And then they sort of break it up after that, which I'm going to save that for when we're in class together, and I'll type that up and give it out to you guys. All right. So let's see. We have the spread of maize cultivation from present-day Mexico northward. We have societies responding. No, hola, Fiona. We have societies responding to the Great Basin. So you have the Plains Native Americans. You have the Mississippi River Valley. You have the Northwest region. All those different societies formed over time, and then they'll eventually play a role as we move into early American history, right? So what are your questions? I feel like we're in class and you guys aren't asking any questions. Do you have anything? Maybe? All right. Well, we can keep looking at these. So different native societies adapted to and transformed their environments through innovations in agriculture resource use. And everyone always asks about the Anacomianda system. That's over in, where is that? Andy, where is that? Remind me. It's on key. Is it 1? I'm looking for it. It's on key concept. Isn't it the Yes, that was in Spanish America, right? All right. So we didn't really go over this too much. And when you start to look at Spanish America, it starts to give you So let's actually get a decent definition of it so you guys understand it. And it had to do with the Spanish actually creating a system in New Spain that sent goods back to Spain, basically. So New Spain was over in Mexico, and this system in particular was a labor system that they set up. And I'm actually making sure I understand the whole thing because I don't typically teach it. Oh, that's right. It's the mestizos and all that. This system. Hi, Alex. My son's on this too. What's up, buddy? This system basically was set up to create a labor system for both the Native Americans and the Spanish that were there. And it actually helped foster a relationship between the Native Americans that were there and the Spanish, which eventually created the mestizos, which we didn't really get into too much. So that's more of the cultural piece of New Spain. And New Spain was different. Let's actually break that down for a minute. When you're looking at the colonies, New Spain was different than New France, was different than New England in their relationships with the Native Americans. So just a reminder, New Spain actually worked with the Native Americans, creating this system of labor, and then they would eventually intermarry and have children, and then those children would become what we know as the Mexican country eventually over time. New France was a little different. They actually worked with Native Americans and they didn't in any way try to try to conquer them, as opposed to the Spanish, where you have the conquistadors, right? You have Cortez and Pizarro, and Cortez and Pizarro basically established what, and I'm getting to this, Fiona, that's a really good question, established what's known as the Columbian Exchange, right? So let's get into that. The Columbian Exchange, named after Christopher Columbus, happened as a result of an exchange between New Spain and oh, look at this. You guys all have questions. This is awesome. New Spain, Europe. I should write some of this stuff down so I make sure I answer everyone's question. Let me grab, hold on, let me get a pad. It'll slow me down a little bit too, and then I'll kind of remember what I need to answer. All right, so first question. Let's talk about the Columbian Exchange. I like that. So we're looking at New Spain. We're looking at, oh, and I can even use this as like a board, right? So here you have North America. This is horrible. And you have Europe. You have Africa, right? And you have the whole triangle trade. Do you remember this? This is horrible, but it's sort of drawn to scale, right? North America, Africa, Europe. And basically the Columbian Exchange was about goods from North America that basically, that was raw materials, right? Let's put that in there. So you have raw materials going from North America into Europe, and those raw materials would make goods. And this is the beginning of the exchange. They would sell goods over to, come on, work. They would sell goods over to North America, and slaves would actually eventually, not right away, remember, hold on to that for a second. We're actually going to come back to that. Slaves would eventually come from Africa into North America, and that was a part of this whole triangular trade. Some of those, there'd be a little bit of trade between these two regions, but not as much. And the idea is that the Columbian Exchange was the first time where you start to see goods going between Europe and between what they called the New World. And that established a system of trade that would eventually perpetuate slavery and would eventually perpetuate this mercantilism, which was the next question here. The difference between the Columbian Exchange and mercantilism. And mercantilism was about sort of the notion that there was a finite amount of wealth in the world. So that finite amount of wealth needed to be capitalized by a nation. And so what we see here is Great Britain, France, and Spain were the three big groups that were trying to capitalize on that. That's a good. Okay, so Siobhan just, I don't know, can you guys, I'm assuming that you can see the chat, but Siobhan just says, was a triangle trade in the Columbian Exchange two names of the same thing? And yeah, they actually were. We call it the Columbian Exchange because it was Christopher Columbus that established it, but slavery wasn't a part of that Columbian Exchange at first. Slavery would be adapted into it over time. Oh, good. That's good to know. Thank you, guys. You guys can't see the chat. So slavery was adapted into it over time, and that didn't happen until 1619. So when you talk about the Columbian Exchange, what you're really talking about is sort of the post-Columbus period, like 1493 up to around the early 1600s. And in 1619, the first slaves are introduced into the Jamestown colony from a Dutch ship. And Jamestown is an English colony, and that's where you see the first slaves coming into North America as part of that exchange. The slave trade doesn't become fruitful for the English until much later because they relied mostly on indentured servitude, which we talked a little bit about, all right? So when we're talking about the beginning of New Spain, New France, and New England, they all form because of different reasons. Let's actually review that a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about that. Let's take New Spain first because they came directly in the wake of Columbus. And New Spain is largely a part of the Reconquista. And the Reconquista, if you guys remember, was the very end of expelling the Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula. And it was right after that where the King of Spain wanted to continue that work in other parts of the world. So when he gave Columbus the charter to take the ships over to all right, Christian, hold on one second. I'll explain that in a second about the slaves. But when the Spanish took the ships, which would eventually land in America, it wasn't just for trade. It was also to send the Spanish out to try to Christianize the world. So when the conquistadors, Cortez and Pizarro, come into New Spain, that actually was a part of that Reconquista, which is why they tried to Christianize that whole region. Yes, I like that. You can compare the Reconquista to Manifest Destiny. And I think that would be a really good synthesis point. Nice. Because if you think about it, it's essentially the same thing. And you can consider the Spanish in New Spain the same as the Native Americans in the Great Plains trying to move westward. And then maybe it wasn't about Christianizing, but maybe it was about adapting them to the American way of life. And that's how you can make that link. Where in one case, Christianity, Catholicism was a huge part of the Spanish culture. Well, the American culture also had some pretty big pieces of it that we tried to adapt to Native Americans, specifically with the ownership of land, right? So you could make a huge arc there, which would be really good in the long essay question and could go a long way in the DBQ. So I like that. I like that a lot. Good point. Now, we have a couple questions here, so I want to make sure that I answer all of them. The first one, I'm gonna, let me go back here. Columbian Exchange, I did. This is a question from Tori. Why did the Spanish intermarry with the natives? That's a really good question. Why did they intermarry with the natives, but also oppress them? That's a good question. You know, that part of New Spain is complicated, where not only did they intermarry with them, but they also enslaved them. Like if you look at the Pueblo Revolt, which is, so I think it was really more regional. And maybe we should look at that a little more in class and let me explore it a little bit, just so I'm not giving you bad information. But for Tori, I think what we're looking at here is in some parts of New Spain, they intermarried, probably closer to, Mexico. And certainly if you go into Mexico, you can trace it back to the Aztecs and the Spanish, which is why you see it in Mexico City, which is where Tenochtitlan was. That's where you start to see it kind of spread out. Oh, okay. So why was Christianity such a big part of Spanish culture, and why did it lead them to conquer the native people? So this is a little outside of what they expect from you guys in the AP test, but it's a really good question because I think it'll help you make that link with the Reconquista Christian. I didn't forget about your question. I'm going to get around to that. Excuse me, that was loud. I have my Red Sox mug. Go Sox. All right. Christianity was a big part of the Spanish culture because Catholicism was very big in Europe until the Reformation period. And the Reformation period kind of answers Christians. We'll get into answering Christians' questions a little bit because we have to talk about the formation of New England. So New Spain was the precursor to New England. Let's put New France aside for a second. Maybe we don't talk about them until the French and Indian War, right? And then we can give you a little bit of background on that when we go over that. But Catholicism was big in Europe. Catholicism ruled Europe for a very long time. And what I mean by that is that the Catholic Church had a great deal of power, so much power that people like Martin Luther and others believed that that power was corrupt. I mean, in a lot of ways, it was corrupt. And what Martin Luther did with his Lutheran Church and his 95 Theses was he was trying to reform the Catholic Church. And by reforming the Catholic Church, he started his own church, this Lutheran Protestantism church, versus treating them fairly. All right, hold on. I'll get to that key concept in a second. Okay, just hold on one second. That's a good question. But so from Lutheranism, it spans into the Reformation in England, which you have Henry VIII and him separating from the Catholic Church. But then that has a rippling effect, right? So that has a rippling effect that eventually leads to the Puritans coming into New England, but also down in into Jamestown, which isn't a part of the Christian part. That has more to do with trade. And it has more to do with the joint stock companies and them trying to make money. So you have Jamestown and you have New England. And do you remember we did a whole thing on comparing the two and how each one was a little different, where New England was more conducive to families as opposed to Jamestown, which was more conducive to young people who just wanted to start over and make money. So that's the big difference between those two regions. And that gets to Christians' question. Before I get to your question, Tori, I think that's Tori who asked about Europe in favor of enslaving natives, but it's definitely related. Slaves came into this country in Jamestown as a part of the workforce, and there were two different workforces essentially in Jamestown. Established in 1607, was the first English colony after the Roanoke colony. If you remember that whole disaster of Roanoke, where they lost the colony from 1585. And it wasn't until 1607, well, it was 1587 when they lost the colony, when they realized that they lost the colony. But then in 1607, Jamestown was established, and they started a cash crop system there. At first, they had the starving time. Hopefully, you remember some of this. Maybe this is jogging your memory. The starving time led to the leadership of John Smith. I gave you guys that primary source of John Smith. You guys should take a look at that and be a little familiar with the primary source of John Smith. And if you need it, I have a copy, or it could be on Google Classroom. So anyway, and it was about the starving time and how they had some major issues trying to adapt to the environment and trying to live away from England. So, all right, you got a lot of good questions on the side over there. I want to answer all of them. All right, so hold on. I'm going to go back and go over all those things. So the Dutch eventually think that they can capitalize on this new colony by sending in slaves. But the English already had a labor system in place. Much like the Spanish had the encomienda system, the English had the indentured servitude system, which actually brought English over, so it didn't incorporate the Native Americans too much. It would eventually incorporate the Native Americans as slaves, but they don't last as slaves. But the indentured servitude seemed like the best way to go because, so this is also, Christian, this next question is all related to, or this next explanation is related to your question here about tobacco. So when John Smith established the colony and set up a system, at first nothing worked. And then after a while, they started working with the Native Americans, and it was John Rolfe who actually worked with the tribe there. And he's the one that came up with a way to make tobacco because he worked with the Native Americans. Then that became a cash crop. And as that became a cash crop over time, they needed more and more labor. So the labor started coming in first with indentured servants, which was the 7-year period, and people would work to pay for their passage coming over from England. But then eventually the indentured servants, if you remember, Kyle and Rod, what are you guys doing? Ryan and Andy and Kyle. I can read all that, by the way, guys. They can all read it too, in case you're wondering. So where was I? All right. Indentured servitude. Right. The indentured servants would eventually have no land. So they'd be free after 7 years and then they wouldn't have any land. And that became a big problem for the English. And we see that especially with Bacon's Rebellion. And at Bacon's Rebellion, that's where you see this these farmers begin to rebel against the English aristocracy. So, which is why they start to invest more and more in slaves. Now, at first, so this goes back to that question. Where did you have it? You had it back here somewhere, Christian. I think it was Christian. Where essentially slaves became big in the colony after they realized they didn't want to have any more indentured servants because it meant that they would have a landless class. But the slaves, they didn't have to worry about that. And in fact, slaves would only give you more slaves. So that's how they saw it. They saw it as a system that perpetuated itself. And as slaves began to survive that trek overseas and stay in on this side of the Atlantic, they became much more profitable. And over time, tobacco started growing better and better and better. And then that became the main crop out of Jamestown. Now, New England was a little different. New England was settled by families, and it was about perpetuating their form of Christianity, which was part of Puritanism. Now we're getting into, well, let me see here. Some of this stuff, most of this stuff is in period 2, the stuff I'm talking about right now. All right, the stuff about Jamestown, the stuff about New England. So a lot of that stuff is in there. Now, getting back though, because I don't want to leave period 1 just yet, but all that was definitely relevant. Getting back to this question about who in Europe was in favor of enslaving the natives versus treating them fairly. And that's key. That's 1.23. Oh, see, that's what you meant. I see. So extended contact with Native Americans and Africans fostered a debate among European religious and political leaders about how non-Europeans should be treated, as well as evolving religious, cultural, and racial justifications for the subjugations of Africans and Native Americans. All right, this is important. This was Las Casas, I believe, and it was Las Casas that started writing about how Native Americans were treated in how Native Americans were treated in New Spain. And there were some pretty major atrocities, especially when Columbus first came over with the Arawak tribe, and also with some other Native Americans from the region that Las Casas writes about. And they start questioning whether or not that the treatment of these Native Americans is appropriate for these Christian nations, and how Christians weren't acting very Christian-like by enslaving. Well, the enslaving part was one piece of it. The larger part was the treatment and how they were being tortured, how they were being brutalized. And Las Casas wrote a lot about that. So Tori, I think you asked me that question. I would take a look at Las Casas. That's Loscasas. And he actually wrote a lot about that. In fact, I think I have some primary sources that would actually be perfect for that one, where he talked about the treatment of these Native Americans. And it was in those first couple of voyages of Columbus when he started talking about that. What kind of labor did New England rely on, if any? New England relied on not necessarily, well, they didn't rely on slave labor, and that's why you have a system of free labor, for lack of a better way to explain it, because we'll go into period 5 a little bit, right? Because free labor was an issue when you're talking about slavery versus the ability to go out and have basically make your own work, right? So you see that system developing in New England because everyone became more, I mean, there was a community in New England. So they had the town hall, they had the common. Remember we talked about that, where, you know, Boston is probably the biggest example of a common, and how everyone gathered around the common and asked questions, or I'm sorry, not asked questions, participated in some sort of government. And essentially that played a role in developing a different culture in New England as opposed to the culture in the South. So they relied on themselves for the labor, and they became very independent. And by doing so, they fostered a different culture in the North than they had in the South, if that makes any sense. But I think that would be a good way to answer a question like that. So, I mean, they did have labor, but it was labor that was paid for, or there were some slaves in the North, by the way. It's not like they had no slaves at all. I mean, if you remember from our trip, John Hancock inherited a slave from his uncle. So New England did have slaves there. All right. Brian. Anyway, Christian, your question. Did New England focus on farming and fishing until the Industrial Revolution? Yeah, New England focused mostly on farming and fishing. Really, 90% of all Americans did some level of farming up until the Civil War. And the Industrial Revolution changes everything. And the Industrial Revolution starts to create job opportunities for people that weren't there prior, and also did a lot to foster a different culture here in the North, one that in the South really couldn't quite catch on yet, but that's a little later. See, what else do we have here? We'll do Bleeding Kansas when we go over period 5 a bit. I think Columbus's ego might be bigger than Roger's forehead. The marriage between Pocahontas and John Rolfe helped European Native relations. Yes, it actually helped it a lot. For a very brief period, though. For a very brief period, because it was right after John Rolfe married Pocahontas, and then the two of them went back to England, and that was where Pocahontas passed away. And then when John Rolfe came back to England, there was a war between the Powhatans and the English, and that was we actually talked a little bit about that. In fact, I may have a PowerPoint. Remind me tomorrow. Somebody remind me tomorrow to post that PowerPoint, because I'm pretty sure I have a PowerPoint on early. In fact, let me look right now while I'm actually talking to you guys. All right. As much as I appreciate the banner, and it's 20 to 9, let's try to stick to questions, all right? Why was there such a large discrepancy between slavery in the North versus the South, even in this time period? Did it have something to do with the families living in the North? That's a good question. It had more to do with climate than anything else. And that goes back to that main question from that first year. How does where you live affect how you live? because think about the climate in the South versus the climate in the North. It gets really cold up here. There's not a lot of agriculture. You don't really have a market for a cash crop in New England. Now the South, you can actually plant all year round. So there's more of a need for slaves. So the slave culture developed in the South as a part of their economy, and then it became a part of their culture, as opposed to in the North, where the slave culture didn't quite take hold because they didn't have that type of work up here. They may have some slaves here and there, but nothing like the South. And really everything took off after the invention of the cotton gin. And then what the cotton gin did, that's not to blame Eli Whitney for the rise of slavery, but the Southerners were in fact capitalists, and they wanted to capitalize on an opportunity. And in this case, that opportunity was that by separating the seeds from the cotton, it made it much easier to export it quicker. So they needed more people to get more cotton so they can put it through the cotton gin. And that's what led to this huge rise in slavery. That, coupled with the fact that in 1808 they were going to shut down the slave trade from overseas. So you see a major rise in slavery after just before 1808. You see this huge spike in the how slaves came into the United States. We can get into the revolution in a second. Just let me look up something here, Amit. I thought I had a PowerPoint on early American history. Almost positive I do. Well, maybe it's under revolution. And if it's under revolution, and I think I have, I'm going to look this up tomorrow. Somebody just needs to remind me tomorrow. And I'm going to look this up, and then I'll post it online because it has a lot of what I just explained to you about the Reformation, about Martin Luther, and it's really good notes since I don't have a lecture on that. And I'm not sure if I used it, but I think it'll actually come in handy. Bear with me. I'm just checking really quick here. You guys can still ask questions. That's fine. Did the Navigation Acts cause more division between colonies in England or more dissent among the people of the colonies? Connected to Amit's question, when did we begin trading with Britain after the war? All right, so these are good questions. Bear with me for a second. No, I'm looking at the wrong thing. Just want to see if I have this while I'm sitting here and remembering it. Otherwise, I'm going to forget. All right, I'll look tomorrow. Christian, you're in charge of reminding me. All right. Okay, here we go. Let me move this to the side. All right, so let's go down the list. So what was the relationship like between the U.S. and Britain after the Revolution? Now we're getting, thank you, Ryan. I appreciate you reminding me. Someone can remind me. Now we're getting into sort of the post-period 3 relationship between the British and the United States. And I would look at the not the Pinckney Treaty, but the other treaty. Oh gosh, I'm blanking on it. The one that everybody hated. Not Pinckney. Who did that one? Help me out. Come on. The treaty after the American Revolution under Washington. I should know this. The Jay Treaty. You rule all. Thank you. So the Jay Treaty is what established the trade relationship between the United States and the British. But also remember that that we fought another war with the British because of trade. So it wasn't perfect after the American Revolution. The War of 1812 was largely because of the fact that we could not establish a good system of trade with the British. So I don't know if that answers your question, Amit. you asked me about that. As for a Christian's question, did the Navigation Acts cause more division between the colonies in England or more dissent among the people of the colonies? The Navigation Acts are largely why we go to war. If you think about it, it was the enforcement of the Navigation Acts that started the customs houses in what is now the United States. And it's also enforcement of the Stamp Act, which was linked to the Navigation Acts, that eventually led us into the Revolution. So the Navigation Acts caused a lot of division, and it was John Hancock was trying to get around the Navigation Acts by smuggling goods into the colonies. So that's one way that it actually led into the war and may have caused more division. Excuse me. So then connecting to Amit's question, when did we begin trading with the Britain after the war? Well, we started trading with the Jay Treaty, but also we don't really have a good trade relationship with the British until after the Civil War. And that's when they start to become more of our trading partner. And it was really World War I that solidified our relationship with the British as it is right now, because we fought with them. And then World War II is what just really created the strongest foundation, where you had King George come over and have hot dogs and hamburgers with Franklin Roosevelt. So that's where you start to see our relationship with the British really begin to get better. But prior to that, it was uneasy for most of the 19th century. I mean, they even wanted to support the Confederacy, if you remember. So the British in the United States had somewhat of a rocky road after the Revolution. Why did Britain enforce navigation as first? This is a good question. Why did Britain not enforce the Navigation Acts at first, but then they did later? And that's because, so it's a variety of things. First, salutary neglect was the policy of the British, and it was salutary neglect, if you guys remember this term. This had to do with basically the British let the colonies govern themselves. So they had self-government, they had their own legislatures, they had their own way of doing things here. And they basically just let it alone. As long as they got those goods coming over from the colonies, they didn't care how things were going on here. But then the colonies got a little greedy and started to trade with the French and started to trade with the Spanish on their own. So they didn't, so then the revenue that should have been going to the crown was actually going to its competitors. So when that happened, the British were like, whoa, you can't do that anymore. And that's where they basically try to consolidate the empire. And they create the Dominion of New England. They set up the Navigation Acts, and they restrict any trade with any other country other than the British. And everything had to go through England. So that's why they didn't enforce it right away, because they wanted to just leave them alone. But then after they established them, they tried to enforce it. But then the French and Indian War happened in 1754, which wasn't too much longer after the Navigation Acts were passed. And it was after the French and Indian War where the British started to lose a lot of money because they were spending it protecting the colonies. And this is where you have the Grenville Program and the leading up to the American Revolution with the Stamp Act and the tax on tea, tax on lead, tax on all sorts of different things, the Sugar Act, all these things that we talked about in class, which I'm going to find that PowerPoint because I'm pretty sure that all this stuff is in there. And it's all the stuff leading up to the American Revolution. All right. I don't know if that answers the question, but giving it a shot. All right, connect to him if you know what were the primary factors in reestablishing Amari, I think I answered your question. What were the primary factors in reestablishing our connection with Britain? It was really more about how we helped the British in World War I and then how we actually helped them in World War II. Were land disputes the main reason for King Philip's Metacom's war? Or were there other factors? Well, the King Philip's War, it was mostly about land, but it was also about power, and it was also about the British wanting to control the New England. So I suppose land was a big piece of it, Steve. But I would argue this. I would argue that it was also about attaining power over Native Americans within that region. And that power, you can argue, even goes back to um, Jamestown in the starving time. So this is an interesting argument. This is actually an argument by Nancy Shoemaker, who's a professor over at UConn. And I'm pretty sure that I mentioned this in class, and it was How Indians Became Red. That's the name of her article. And How Indians Became Red, she would argue that the British in particular, because they felt inept about the starving time and they weren't able to survive the same way that the Native Americans were, they started to create a difference with the Native Americans. They started to call them red savages, things like that. So that because they're the British and because they're supposed to be the best at everything, this historian in particular argues that the notion of racism and racial distinction between the two groups started not necessarily with the enslavement of Africans, but with the starving time, and how the starving time started creating a separation based on complexion. So the complexion that the British chose was red. Now that relates back to your question about King Philip's War, because King Philip's War was also about power, and it was also about establishing the English in the New England region. And so while it was about land and sort of the what they attained from it was property taken from Native Americans, it was also about asserting their control over Native American tribes. Christian, I know you were asking me about the headright system. Bear with me. I will absolutely get to it. And yes, it is very similar to the Homestead Act of the 1800s, where the headright system was plots of land that they would promise the English when they came into Jamestown. It's very, very similar. I think that's a good way to look at it. The difference is the Homestead Act was a little more had a little more teeth to it. But and what I mean by that is you had to live in the land for 5 years. You had to do certain things. You needed 160 acres, and they would use the basis of the Homestead Act to set up the Dawes Severalty Act in the with the Native Americans after the Civil War. So the 160-acre idea and plots of land and farming in the Midwest really came out of the Homestead Act, as opposed to the headright system, which was really more about rewarding people for their work, if I remember correctly. I haven't taught the headright system in a while, but we'll take a look at that in a second. Did the British support the Confederacy primarily for trading cotton or for other political reasons? It was a combination of both. They needed cotton for their own industrial revolution. But also think about it. The British didn't want the Republic to survive. The Civil War was still a moment in history where there were a ton of monarchies throughout the world, and nobody wanted to see the Republic survive. So if the Civil War were to break apart the Republic that the founders were trying to create, well, that was a win for the British as far as they were concerned, because monarchy was a big part of their life and was a big part of their system. And so if democracy and the Republic can't do it in America, then maybe it's not going to work throughout the world, which is why when Lincoln wrote or said in his Gettysburg Address that this war was testing this nation so conceived, if it could ever work in the history of the world, which is why the stakes for the Civil War were so important, were so high. So yes, primarily it was for trading cotton, but I would argue that there were more political reasons. Why was the French and Indian War important? French and Indian War is important for three main reasons. One, it was important because it created a great deal of debt for the British that they then had to get back. And that debt was something that caused a lot of the friction between the colonies and the British. I didn't forget about the headright system, Christian, don't worry. So that's number one. So first, it created debt, which created friction. The second thing is the colonists began to establish their own identity as a result of the French and Indian War. Think about it. The Albany Plan under Ben Franklin came up with which, while it failed, it was the first attempt to create a colonial Congress, that would work with the that would work with the Native Americans and the British. So it's the first time we ever see anything like that happen, and it's the first time where they all meet and they all agree. And well, to some extent, that we were going to have, not necessarily that they agreed that they would actually create this council. So you see that happen. And the third thing, which I think is very important, is the colonists realized that they didn't need the British to protect themselves. They had armies. They had people like George Washington and Henry Knox, and people who fought in war, and they were able to fight alongside the British just as well as the British. And that contributed to, really, you see the French and Indian War. This is a good question, Andy, because you see the French and Indian War. Some people argue that it's more important than the American Revolution to begin this journey to create an American identity. And the American identity and so we're getting into period 3 a little bit here, all right? But the American identity that we associate with the American Revolution, like the join or die identity, or the whole notions of the Declaration of Independence, a lot of people argue began in 1754 with the French and Indian War, which was a part of a larger war called the 7 Years' War. And it was just fought in North America. And a lot of colonists started to see themselves as being independent of the British. And that's what eventually led to independence, which gets into, hold on, why did British care so much about the colonies, not so much about other places? All right, Kylie, that's a good question. Hold on to that for a second. Siobhan asked, was Britain's debt part of the reason why they taxed the colonies so much? Yes. That's where all the taxes came from. So you take the French and Indian War. So, from Andy's question, take the French and Indian War and then move it forward. Think about it. The French and Indian War ended in 1763. So it started in 1754, ends in 1763. The Stamp Act is 1765, 2 years later. It was the Crown that came up with this notion. We need to make money back from these colonists. And in addition to that, and this, Kylie, this sort of answers your question too. In addition to using the taxes as a way to reclaim debt, it's also a way to control the colonies, to assert control over the colonies in such a way that they can start to consolidate that power again. They cared about these colonies in particular because there was such a great deal of wealth and resources here that wasn't in any other part of the British Empire, which is why they still maintain a trade relationship with us in the wake of the American Revolution, because they needed those resources. So if you go back and you start to consider how that played a role in this interesting dynamic, they wanted to consolidate their power, and they wanted to tax the colonies and have navigation acts over the colonies. But it's that long train of usurpations that comes from the Declaration of Independence, this long train of usurpations where they keep trying to tax or try to restrict the colonists in some way. So you can look at the Proclamation of 1763, which is right after the French and Indian War, so that they don't mess with the French anymore. So that they don't mess with the Native Americans anymore. They meaning the colonists. And then that has a rippling effect with the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act and the Quartering Act and all those different things that came out of George Grenville's program. So all of that begins to have sort of a snowball effect leading into the American Revolution. Also remember this before I get into the next question, because that question about the French is important. The revolutionary generation was the first generation born in the colonies. So think about that. They never, with the exception of Thomas Paine, which is pretty interesting when you think about it, because Thomas Paine spoke this whole language of liberty and, but with the exception of Thomas Paine, none of them were born in Britain. So it's almost like take, for example, a lot of us, we can trace our ancestry back to Italy and like like Italy or Portugal. But I wasn't born in either place. I don't have an attachment to either one. I have an attachment to this country. So you start to develop an identity because of just your birthplace and your surroundings. And that contributed as well. And a lot of historians talk about that. So all those things combined, you start to see the beginning of this new American identity that was separate from the British. And despite the fact that they were all British, as I say over and over and over again, and in fact, when you look at their assertion of their rights as individuals, there's rights as Englishmen. That's what they were trying to assert. Not necessarily new rights. These are rights that already exist. Rights that have been established by the English Bill of Rights, by the Magna Carta, by the Petition of Right, by all those documents that came prior to the Declaration of Independence. These English people were asserting their rights as Englishmen. Lockean rights, natural rights. John Locke was an English philosopher. So they still had a connection to Britain, but by breaking apart, the irony of the whole thing is they were acting as Britons would act, if that makes any sense. All right, let me see. Britain's debt party, yes. Okay, what was the main reasons? Okay, why did the French support us during the war? Well, this gets back to the importance of the French and Indian War, where the French were basically, all their land was taken from them after the French and Indian War. Remember, going back, the Ohio River Valley, which was being fought over by the French and the British, that was the most important land in North America at the time. And when the British won that war, they staked a claim over the Ohio River Valley. So the French wanted that land back. They wanted to have some of a colonial presence within North America. So they helped us out for two reasons. One, they hated the British. It was their mortal enemy. That's how they saw. And this goes way back to, we're not going to get into this, but into the Norman invasion of the British of Britain. And at one point, the British king was the king not only of England but also of France. So they have a very long history together. But the second reason, besides them not liking each other, but the second reason is that land in North America, which was really important to the French crown. I hope that answers that question. So they really wanted to capitalize on this opportunity. Did the French want the Republic to survive? That's a really good question. I don't know. They never opposed it. I mean, if you look at the history and you look at the evidence, they were never against the United States, with the exception of the quasi-war with France. That was more of an issue because we didn't support them in their war with the British. So it had nothing to do with our system of government, where the British would actually argue that the Republic was a threat to monarchy. I don't think the French ever argued that, and they certainly had their own revolution in 1789. So no, I think they wanted the Republic to survive, as opposed to the British that would very much like to see it fall apart. All right, so wait, where are we? Was there any particular reason it seems that the northern colonies favored independence? Well, all right, so Christian, you have a good question. So both the northern and the southern colonies favored independence. Think about it. The Declaration of Independence was written by a Virginian. George Washington was a Virginian. The first 6 presidents of the Republic, of those 6 presidents, 4 of them? 5? 4. 4 of them were Virginians. Washington was a Virginian. Then you had Adams from Massachusetts. Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. After Monroe, you have John Quincy Adams. So of those first 6, 4 were from Virginia, 2 were from Massachusetts. So the power of the Republic came from Massachusetts and Virginia. So the Deep South, which is where most of the cotton was grown, actually Virginia had cotton plantations, but not like it did in the Deep South. You saw more loyalist support in the Deep South, and you saw more loyalist support in New York, because the New York harbor was where everything came in and out of the colonies. And a lot of it had to do was where was the trade focused, and that's where the loyalists' support actually came from. Does that make sense? I think it makes sense. And it's getting late, so I'm not always on my game when it's late. For Christian, does it have stuff to do? Lies in the South and trade with Britain. Yeah, Aiden. That's a good question. All right. Is it arguable that Massachusetts and Virginia were the two most powerful? Yes, absolutely. Massachusetts and Virginia, then later Ohio, believe it or not. We had a ton of presidents and a lot of political power coming out of Ohio. But Massachusetts and Virginia was seen, especially in the early Republic period, as having a great deal of power, especially within the executive branch. And if you think about it, both the major political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, because they either came from Massachusetts or they came from, well, with the exception of Hamilton, who actually came from New York. But, nevertheless, Hamilton was never president, but he still had a great deal of political power. But Kylie, I think you're on to something where you could argue that both Massachusetts and Virginia, not only did they lead during the American Revolution, people like John Adams and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson playing a major role in the formation of the Republic in the wake of the Revolution. But you can also argue that in the early Republic period, when things were very critical and they had to come up with a good system of government in the wake of the Articles of Confederation failing. In fact, where was the great, Shays Rebellion was in Massachusetts, right? So if it's not working in Massachusetts, we have to fix it. And that's what led eventually to the Constitutional Convention, which was decided not in Philadelphia. It was decided in Virginia at Annapolis, where Washington met with Hamilton and Madison, and they said, we need to have a constitutional convention. And then they went to Philadelphia because that's where the revolution took place. And there was a good deal of political power within Pennsylvania, but even, what's his name? The Letters from a Farmer. John Dickinson. Even John Dickinson wasn't for independence. He was more of a middle road person, as opposed to Benjamin Franklin, who they were both in Pennsylvania, but Franklin was more of a politician. And he sort of went, went wherever the politics took him. Oh, Bruins are winning. All right, Andy, thank you. I do appreciate that. It is good to have an update. All right, this may be slightly outside of the time period. I'm not sure, but can we go over? Yeah, we could certainly go over the slave codes and slave life in various regions. It depends on what you're talking about. I mean, if you're talking about slave life in the South prior to the Civil War, that's one thing. If you're talking about slave life in New Spain or where the Pueblos were, well, that's another thing. I can tell you this, that the slave codes were something that I think are you talking about the black codes or the slave codes? The black codes were set up after the Civil War, and that basically established a new culture within the South, which is why you have Reconstruction the way that it was, because they went into the South and found these different ways of living, which we talked a little bit about, which that's not Jim Crow, so that's not segregation. So why don't we table that one? Let's talk a little bit more tomorrow about why you about what you mean by slave codes and what you mean by slave life in various regions. We can certainly talk about that tomorrow. That isn't an issue. So would people have preferred a middle ground be found between independence and being under colonial? All right, that's a good question. So Christian asked a good question about where people fell during the revolution. And John Adams had this famous quote saying that when it comes to independence, the colonies really were a third, and a third. So a third for independence, a third against independence, and a third on the fence. John Dickinson fell on the fence. John Adams fell on the fence too, actually. He wasn't all for the revolution at first. He was for law, and he wanted the law to prevail, and not American law because it didn't exist. He wanted English law to prevail. And in fact, one of the greatest examples of that is he defended Thomas Preston, who was accused at the Boston Massacre. So he got up there and he defended him, and he argued that people needed to see a system of laws work. So eventually he becomes committed not necessarily to this radical idea of revolution, but the notion that you can create a system of laws. People can create a system of laws, not kings. People will create a system of laws that will govern society. And that's what I think moves someone like John Adams over to independence. And I think there was a strong movement in this country to sort of be in the middle. And that's why it took so long before a revolution happened. Because remember, we're looking at, like I said before, the Proclamation of 1763 to 1775, which is the Battle at Lexington and Concord. That's 12 years. I mean, that's all the time you were in school so far, since kindergarten. Think about that. And now all of a sudden we're going to war. This didn't just happen overnight. This is something that happened over a period of time, and people had to eventually lose their connection to Britain. So no one wanted to go to war right away, and certainly John Dickinson didn't. But that said, when they did decide to go to war, John Dickinson was one of the first to sign up, despite the fact that he didn't vote for the Declaration of Independence, and he abstained from that vote. He still, once the vote was made and a decision was made with people who he believed were his countrymen, he actually followed through on it. I hope that kind of answered your question, Christian. That it's a good question. I don't know if people would have preferred a middle ground, but it certainly wasn't a definite that we were going to revolt against the British. It was something that took place over a series of time. All right, next question. Such as a religious autonomy in the South, like how much were they allowed to preserve their culture? And oh, you're going back to the slave culture. All right, let's talk about that for a minute. And then the next question is about the biggest difference between American philosophy law and English philosophy law. There really isn't that big of there's a difference in the law. Hold on that. All right, so the slave culture in the South. So this is getting a little outside of the period because you don't start to see a distinct slave culture develop in the South until maybe the 19th century, just after the Revolution. Well, I shouldn't say that. What I mean by a distinct slave culture is not necessarily when slaves were first brought into this country, they still maintained a lot of the culture from Africa. And in those early stages, you start to see that culture morph over time to include other parts of English culture, or even Native American culture to some extent, but mostly English culture because they lived with English people. And certain parts of Christianity were infused into that culture. I have some interesting points on this actually from a book that I have here that maybe we can talk about it more tomorrow. But ultimately, the slave culture, as it evolves over time, becomes very distinct and something that is a part of the Southern culture in the wake of the Civil War. I don't know if that answers your question. Kind of answers your question, but it is something that over time develops as they stay in captivity. In fact, so let's go back to that religious piece for a minute. Eventually, Christianity plays a very big role in slave culture, which is why a lot of the leaders in the civil rights movement, for example, were reverends. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, the Reverend Ralph D. Abernathy, the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth. All of those people were major movers and shakers in the civil rights movement. And they were movers and shakers because they had a leadership position within the culture of the African American communities in the South. And that didn't just happen. That was something that happened over time. Think about it for a second. The Black Codes after the Civil War, they didn't allow freed slaves to gather in groups. So they could, however, go to church. So by going to church on Sundays, they had an opportunity to discuss a lot of issues. And the Reverend became the leader who a lot of them asked questions and wanted to get involved. So that's where you start to see the spiritual leaders of the civil rights movement come out of these these churches, because for years prior, a lot of the African Americans in those communities were looking to those men as leaders, and eventually women too, who would also play a role, especially in the civil rights movement. Women played a major role in the civil rights movement. People like Diane Nash, Ella Baker. This is going into more of period 8, which we're looking at right now. But Diane Nash, Ella Baker, Rosa Parks, of course, all of these women played a big role in the perpetuation and moving the civil rights movement forward. It wasn't just Martin Luther King and all these other individuals who you read a lot about. It was a grassroots movement. And you can argue that grassroots movement begins going all the way back to the culture in the South, just prior to the Civil War, just after the Civil War, that fostered a certain type of leadership where both men and women were able to play a role in that, in fostering what would become, in my opinion, one of the greatest movements in United States history, with the civil rights movement. All right, where are we here? Because I'm starting to get tired, to be perfectly honest with you guys. We're a little over an hour, but hold on, let me just look at this for a second. Kylie, the biggest difference between American philosophy of law and English philosophy of law, I don't know enough about that. I can tell you that our system of law is based on the English system of law, but there are differences, and in some cases, major differences. And certainly with the Constitution itself, that becomes the biggest difference, our system of government and where power comes from. But actual laws themselves, we still have laws on the books from the colonial period, which that's when we were under British rule. So those laws translated over fairly easy to the new American system of law. So our system is different, but it's only different over time. It wasn't different immediately. We based everything on that English system. So we can talk more about that if you want. How important was Crispus Attucks in the Revolution? Well, the Boston Massacre would be where that plays a role, Andy. And that's a good question, Christian. So would the Boston Massacre have been such a big deal if Revere hadn't made that infamous depiction? That's a good question. Certainly, the Sons of Liberty made clear with regard to that instance that this was one of those moments in history where British tyranny, and they were trying to paint the British as tyrannical, right? So by painting them as tyrannical as part of their propaganda network, that actually made a big difference in moving those people. Remember, I told you a third, and a third. So those third that were on the fence started to move more toward independence. They weren't quite there though, but eventually they would be moved more so by Thomas Paine's common sense than anything else. But certainly the Boston Massacre contributed to, remember that phrase, a long train of usurpations. And so over a period of time, all of these things combined created a moment where there's just so much we can take. We cannot deal with this anymore. We have to declare independence. So I would argue that the Boston Massacre was on the road to that. Remember, that happened in 1770. So the Boston Massacre happened in 1770. That's 5 years before Lexington and Concord. It's just before the Boston Tea Party happened in 1773. So you see, all these things happen years apart, but we always teach them in like quick succession. So we don't really think about how they may have slowly over time played a role in developing this new sense of an American identity. I don't know if that makes sense, but anyway, that's how I see it. All right, Kylie, if our system was so similar, then why were people so wary of the monarchy? Well, all right, now that's a good question, but it wasn't similar in where power came from. So you're looking at inherited power versus power based on somebody's talents. So you could achieve, I'm just canceling this out here, hold on. So in the United States, in this new system of government, you could achieve, you can become president of the United States. You can never be king in the monarchy unless you were born into it. So this notion of inherited power and power coming from royalty, just because you were born into a certain family, was when they're talking about all men are created equal. That's what they're talking about. It has nothing to do with your race or your ethnicity or even your well, to some extent, your socioeconomic level, but it had more to do with power coming from the people as opposed to coming from an inherited class, a class that was just called noble because they were born into nobility. So that's the biggest part where our system begins to differ. Where it stays the same is the notion of jurisprudence and law, and how law is interpreted, and how law has to be attached to some sort of document or some sort of system of rights. So the English Bill of Rights, the Petition of Right, the Magna Carta, all of those things were English law. And this notion of English rights and the rights of Englishmen were translated into what we now interpret as rights for American people. So in that case, we take from the British what we like, and then we throw away the inherited part, and we say we are going to be a country of the people, by the people, for the people, as opposed to the monarchy. But your law system, your courts, and things like that, they're not that dissimilar to the English system. I mean, even John Adams was a lawyer in the English system, and he translated that into being a lawyer for the American system, and he was one of the architects of this system. So he learned about it from the English system. So it's a really good question when you start to get into the nuance of the history. Certainly people like John Marshall, who interpreted the Constitution, begins to develop a level of jurisprudence within this country. It starts with him, and we continue to use those ideas as we move forward, especially when we're looking at the concept of judicial review, which was implied within the Constitution, but isn't really acted upon until Marbury versus Madison. Yes, our Constitution does get some of its framework from the British as well as the Enlightenment, Christian. Yeah. So our Constitution, a lot of it comes from the Enlightenment. And well, all right. So take the Connecticut Constitution, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. Why are we called the Constitution State? Because the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut was in fact a constitution. And the notion of a constitution is something that was an English idea. And having a constitution set up a system of government, but that system of government had to be linked back to the crown. So it was a constitution, but it wasn't a constitution of the people. It was a constitution for the king or queen of England. So what we did was we maintained that framework, and then we attached the power to the people, and we did that through our democratic process and the creation of a republic, which is a representative democracy. So that's what begins to separate us from the British. But if you notice, we still maintain a constitution. We still maintain a system that's laid out for the people, and that's an English way of doing things, if that makes sense. And the Enlightenment, historians have argued, and I would argue the same, that the United States of America is the greatest achievement of the Enlightenment. That the Enlightenment basically set up a questioning of authority, which is something I like to do too, as you guys know, a questioning of authority that enhanced other people's rights, and in such a way that it started to, because the Enlightenment wasn't just about rights and all these other, it was also about questioning the overarching authority, which goes back to one of the first questions tonight about the power of the church and why was the church so important in Spanish culture. Well, the church was important throughout all of Europe. And one of the things the Enlightenment did was question the power of the church. Even the notion of a heliocentric universe versus us, it's what, terracentric, us being the center of the universe as opposed to us rotating around the sun, you start to see challenging this idea that that Christianity wasn't always right. And just that challenge right there started in motion a series of events that eventually made its way into the American Revolution. And that's where a lot of it comes from. this whole challenging of authority. First, they challenged the church, and then you see that with the Reformation, and then you see it brought to the United States with the Puritans, and then it continues within New England, and it continues throughout the colonies to challenge the British because they believed that they were being tyrannical. And then you can link that back to the Romans, and the Romans has more to do with Julius Caesar and how Julius Caesar was seen as a tyrant and how they took out the tyrants, which we can talk more about. But the framers were very aware of this whole notion of tyranny and how it's linked to a system of government, especially when it comes to a republic. And that's where a lot of that comes from. All right. Are there any other questions? Did I get most of them? I think I got most of them. We went over a lot, guys. We actually did a lot on period 3. But just let me call up that. I had it here. Here it is. Let me call this up again, bring it back over here so I can see your questions. Period 1. Period 1's short. There's only 2 parts of it. Period 2 is when you start to get into some interesting stuff. I will tell the dogs that you said hi, and I do appreciate. You're very welcome. And I'm glad the Bruins are winning. All right, so on that note, let's do this. You're very welcome, everyone. You're very welcome. Let's talk tomorrow. See if we can do this again tomorrow night with you're very welcome. See if we can do this tomorrow night with periods. We can maybe finish up a little bit of period 3 and do 4, 5, maybe 6. We could talk Civil War tomorrow, Amit, if you're still out there. I'm not sure if you're still there. I think if I end this, it'll save it. I'm hoping it'll say this. You guys are the best students ever. I'm not the best teacher ever. Thank you for being up with me and talking. So I'll see you guys tomorrow. You want me to say it? Meantime, rest easy and read history. I'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.